My son turned to his wife and muttered, "She's just old and bitter," after I asked if I could sit at the dinner table with them. I gave a small laugh, masking the sting, and a few days later, I quietly purchased the very company where he worked. 2 days after that, HR informed him of the new reality. You'd think after years of enduring sharp remarks, subtle neglect, and that suffocating form of polite dismissal, I would have grown a tougher skin. But those few careless words of his struck deeper than anything before, like a final bell tolling, signaling the collapse of something I once believed unshakable. When I asked, "May I join dinner?" my voice was steady, though inside I felt as though I was borrowing breath from someone else entirely. I stood there at the edge of their glossy modern living room, a place that used to be home to me, though now it felt alien, stripped of warmth. The light from the fixtures above poured down, bright but indifferent, revealing furniture chosen more for photographs than for memories. I kept my tone soft because I still believed in family courtesies, in the unspoken promises that family doesn't turn each other away. But my son only glanced at me, his expression detached, his lips cutting sharp as a scalpel as he replied, "She's just a leftover, bitter, useless. Why bring her into dinner?" His words hung in the air with an almost absurd calmness, brutal in their simplicity. What sliced through me wasn't just what he said, but the realization behind it, that I had ceased to matter. In that instant, decades of love unraveled in silence. I froze, breath shallow, chest tight with memory. The afternoons when he'd run into my arms after school, knees scraped and tears streaking his cheeks. I remembered how buttercups and bandages were my tools of comfort, how lullabies spilled from me late into the night. Now all those tender recollections crumbled under the crushing weight of indifference. My daughter-in-law's face remained placid, composed, almost as if she were a model posed for a painter. With a graceful gesture, she raised her hand and directed me toward the hall, as though guiding an unwanted sculpture back into storage. Her words floated behind me, delicate yet cutting, "Our new life doesn't have space for relics." I crossed the threshold in silence, my footsteps echoing with rejection. The hallway smelled faintly of expensive candles and men's cologne, fragrances meant to impress, but to me they only concealed the truth. On the walls, carefully staged photographs displayed promotions, vacations, and frozen smiles, all evidence of a future where I had no place. Outside, I trembled as I stepped into the evening air. A street lamp flared against my car, its light drawing out the shadows that had followed me all along. I drove back to my small refuge, tears slipping down without sound, my headlights cutting across an empty road ahead. Life outside kept going. Neighbors walked their dogs under golden halos, cars glided past, people laughed and planned their nights. And yet, I felt hollow, as if someone had stripped the windows from my soul and left me exposed to nothing but cold wind. I climbed the narrow stairs to my little room above the garage, the one corner of the world that belonged more to me now than anywhere else. The door shut behind me with a final click, locking me into solitude. There was no chatter there, no background laughter, only the hum of night and the weary creak of a ceiling fan. I perched on the bed's edge, the rough pillow fabric pressing into my wrist, my heart beating to the rhythm of memories, family dinners, whispered advice by the lamp, lessons I once believed mattered. In that quiet, I clung to the fragile belief that I had once been important. But then from below, my grandson's voice pierced my refuge, carefree, mocking, sharp in its cruelty. "Grandma snores like a broken vacuum. Are we even sure she's alive?" I froze, a fresh sting of humiliation tightening my jaw. Even the youngest had learned to see me as an object of ridicule. I clenched my teeth, anger mingling with grief, and drifted toward the window. The moonlight spilled in, cold and unyielding, covering the world in pale silver. The street outside was calm, still wrapped in shadows. The driveway lay empty, yet I envied the night itself, its shadows, its silence, for offering a kind of embrace I could no longer find in my family. I leaned against the sill, the glass cool against my fingers, and my mind slipped backward. I thought of night drives with my husband when we talk about planting gardens after the children grew, about dreams we still wanted to chase. I remembered tucking scraps of poetry into lunchboxes, my shy attempt to share with him the delicate need I had to write something lasting. And most of all, I remembered the hospital, the promise I made to sit beside him, telling him I always would. I drew in a long breath, trying to steady myself. A tremor rippled through me, but I held the tears back. Not yet. The silence around me felt like it was splitting me apart, yet strangely it also hardened me. They had called me useless, as though my existence could be erased with a few cruel words. They wanted me to disappear. And yet, in that quiet room under the watchful glow of the moon, I felt something stir deep inside me, something fierce, old, and alive. A voice within me whispered, "I was here. I still am." I slid open the bedside drawer and found a pen, fragile and cracked, but still mine to hold. From a small notebook once used for students' assignments, I tore a page. My fingers shook as I gripped it, and the thought struck me, no, I wasn't ready to vanish. My hand moved across the paper, uneven but deliberate. I wrote one single trembling line. "I will not apologize for existing." I closed the notebook, then closed my eyes. A moment later my body stopped trembling. Stillness took over. And when dawn finally came, I lay there awake, eyes wide open, listening to the quiet. This time the silence no longer frightened me. My lungs pulled in air, steady and calm, but my heart thundered with something untamed, pride in survival. And survival, I realized, was enough. For years I had clung to the quiet faith that legacy was built on kindness, on the imprints of small sacrifices. I believed such footprints would outlast time itself. I had given my life to teaching social science at a respected university, devoting myself to research on family, community, and the empathy that binds generations. I hadn't chased recognition, it found me. My work spoke to policymakers, to leaders, to students searching for meaning. In my office, walls lined with books and cards from grateful students, I felt rooted. Back then I believed, truly believed, that knowledge nurtured compassion. And because of that belief, I gave everything I had to my son. When he wanted to go to college, I sold the small apartment my parents had left me, a sanctuary of my own, and poured every penny into his future. I thought I was giving him the wings I never had. I thought by doing so I'd one day watch him soar with pride. I remember his graduation as if it happened yesterday. I dressed carefully, hair freshly styled, a modest dress smoothed over my knees, palms sweating as I waited in the crowded auditorium. My heart pounded like a drum as he crossed the stage, diploma in hand. For a fleeting second he spotted me. His face lit up with a smile, and I thought, this is it, he'll wave to me, proud, grateful. But instead he tilted his head and muttered under his breath, just loud enough for the students nearby to hear, "That was 20 years ago, Mom. I've moved past that pity project." The words slammed into me like a punch I never saw coming. My knees felt weak, the ground itself shifting under my feet. In that instant something delicate inside me cracked. The love that had fueled my sacrifice, selling my safe place, my inheritance, was reduced to a dismissive label. Pity project. Once those sacrifices had been badges of honor. Now they were dust, something shameful, something he wanted erased from his story. Later that night I lay in bed burning with fever. The doctor said it was pneumonia, dangerous for someone my age. I remember asking my daughter-in-law for a bowl of warm broth. She looked me over, her expression polished but indifferent, and replied coolly, "Stop dressing so plainly. People expect bright energy, not hospice gray." She didn't mean it as an attack. It was just her obsession with image, always image. But those words cut sharper than accusations ever could. She had placed me in a category. Outdated, unsightly, an inconvenience to her carefully curated aesthetic. Even while sick and struggling to breathe, I forced myself to rise. I stumbled to the bathroom, brushed on lipstick with shaking hands, and changed clothes. My soft gray cardigans, my beloved sweaters with patched elbows, the garments that had carried my story, were folded neatly into the basket. I traded them for something brighter, something false. Lying back in bed, I felt every bone ache. Yet beneath the illness, beneath the physical strain, what hurt most was the emptiness. The knowledge that the woman I once was had been erased. The mother who believed in him, the professor who shaped minds, the comforter of late-night tears. She was no longer welcome in their narrative. As the days stretched on, I scrolled through their photographs. Glittering dinner parties, exotic vacations, shiny awards. They laughed, they celebrated, but never with me. Slowly, I understood. They were rewriting the family story, and in their version I no longer existed. I began to see myself as a missing archive. Something they assumed was empty when in truth I was overflowing with history, with the very roots that had shaped them. That realization pushed me back to writing, though not in the language of academia anymore. Instead, I scribbled fragments of memoirs, scraps of thought captured in a small notepad I kept hidden beneath the mattress. One of the first lines I wrote, my hand trembling, was, "They have forgotten everything I built. They admire the outcomes but erase the sacrifices. They treat my love like a credit line, exhausted then discarded." It hurt to write such truths, but I understood something then. A story unwritten is easy to rewrite. If I didn't preserve my version, they would overwrite me. So I poured my hurt into ink, not as venom but as testimony. Yes, a bitterness lingered in those pages, but not a bitterness toward them. My anger turned inward, toward the role I had played all my life, the fiddle that played unseen while others danced to its music. I resented the injustice of it all, the way I was treasured only when convenient, then discarded the moment my presence complicated things. Sometimes I would look into the mirror and still catch glimpses of her. The tireless professor, the mother who carried him, the woman who once stood in lecture halls teaching dignity, teaching cohesion, teaching how we survived together. That woman hadn't died, but in their eyes she was invisible. In their world, the rules had shifted. Gratitude no longer had space for an aging body or for love that had already spent itself. And yet, that memory of who I had been refused to vanish. I began collecting proof of my existence. Newspaper clippings of my research, photographs of me at conferences, local awards for civic work, liner notes where colleagues had thanked me by name. Each relic reminded me, I was once celebrated not for vanity but for devotion, for integrity, for pouring my soul into others. I had given far more than I ever expected to receive. One bitter winter evening, as the wind rattled the window panes, I stared at those fragments of my past and felt something ignite in my chest. Not revenge but recognition. A clarity. They could forget me, yes, but forgetting does not erase. My life still mattered. What I had built still lived. In margins, in memories, in the lives of students and communities touched by my work. And one day I promised myself those margins would not stay hidden. I would write them back into the story whether anyone was listening or not. So the nights became my companions. I drafted letters, never sent but carefully composed, to grant committees, to former students, to community leaders and trustees. With every page I began stitching my relevance back together. I was not a pity project. I was the very foundation beneath them, the ground they had mistaken for disposable. They might outgrow my presence in their narrative, but they could never truly outgrow what I had given them. By the time I closed the notebook and let the moonlight soften my room, I felt something shift. The bitterness was buried beneath resolve. I wasn't angry, not exactly. I was awakening. I thought I could one day sleep through their indifference, let fatigue dissolve into acceptance. But I learned quickly, time does not erase words. At 2:17 a.m., when the world outside lay still and the weekend buzz seemed far away, I woke with a jolt. My son's voice carried clearly through the wall that separated their hallway from my small room above the garage. His tone was flat, practical, as if he were talking about rescheduling a meeting. "We should just stage a grandma can't make it funeral dinner." My heart seized. My breath caught. That phrase, funeral dinner, fell over me like dirt on a coffin. My own child had reduced me to a rehearsal for grief, a line item on an agenda, a nuisance to be written out neatly. And then came the laughter. High, sharp, glass thin. My daughter-in-law's voice cutting in, "Call it closure. Everyone can forget we ever had her." Her words carved deeper than the idea itself. It wasn't only that I was unwanted, I was unwanted officially, unwanted in record, as though my erasure had to be polished for public display. They didn't just want me gone, they wanted me erased cleanly, like I had never mattered. The room closed in. Darkness pressed against me like a co-conspirator. Yet I didn't cry. I can't fully explain why. Perhaps because tears belong to loss and I wasn't ready to concede that I had lost. Or maybe because crying would have made me too exposed, too vulnerable in the face of outright betrayal. Instead, I felt rage crawl into my hands, my fingertips pulsing as if my veins carried fire instead of blood. I reached for the brass reading lamp at my bedside but stopped short. No, I wouldn't numb myself with sleep. I would keep vigil. I would witness. And then an idea came. I had to record this crime of the heart. Perhaps one day my voice would matter again, if not to them then to someone willing to listen. I slid out of bed, the floorboards sighing beneath my weight, and crept toward the wall, toward the place where their voices had struck like unholy hymns. The house felt too small, the silence too vast. But I refused to shrink into invisibility. With trembling hands, I pulled open the drawer and retrieved a notebook I'd carried since my own graduation. Its cover was plain, soft, its pages blank and waiting. I set it on my lap, pen in hand, and let the silence seep into its margins. Then I wrote the words that echoed like a curse in my mind. Funeral dinner. They said to forget me as if I'd never existed. My hand gripped the pen and I began to write. Every single word, every poisonous syllable. I wrote in short, sharp bursts, pressing the ink so hard into the page it felt like the insults were burning straight through the paper. We should just pretend Grandma died and hold a funeral dinner. Call it closure. Everyone can move on like she was never here. When I read the words back, they looked almost alien to me, foreign in shape but painfully familiar in their cruelty. I froze, my fingers suspended over the paper as if waiting for permission to keep going. The room was dim and the moon spilled its pale silver light across the page, making my words gleam like truth carved into stone. That same moon had been my silent companion the night before, steadying me with resolve. Now it stood witness to this record. I wrote one more line, small, firm, unshaking. They don't realize I can hear them, but they'll learn soon enough what happens when I refuse to disappear. My fingers felt numb as I closed the notebook. A strange steadiness took root in me, like something had latched onto my bones and refused to let go. I folded the page carefully, placed the pen beside it, and touched the cover as though it were my own skin. Rising to my feet, I felt the moon brighten the outline of my body. I shivered, not from chill but from the force of momentum gathering inside me. I wasn't going to melt into silence anymore. I was here. I was not vanishing for their comfort or convenience. Without a word, I crossed to the window, flung it open and let the night breathe into the room. The cool air carried whispers from the outside world. Hints of strangers running toward their tomorrows, streetlights flickering against asphalt, cars rushing past unnoticed. And in that moment I turned those whispers inward. Existence isn't just about being visible. It's about choosing to stand tall even when the world insists on looking away. The moon stayed with me, a silent guardian, while I listened to the steady rhythm of my own heartbeat. Slowly, I drew the window shut and returned to bed, not surrendering but holding clarity close to me like armor. I didn't yet know what I would do, but I felt ready. Not boiling with rage, not broken with despair, simply radiant with determination. Morning would come soon enough. For now I lay awake not as a fading memory but as a force, unyielding, unashamed, alive. The next day, sunlight spilled through the curtains with an almost innocent promise, touching every object in the room that had absorbed my grief and defiance. I sat on the edge of my bed, tracing the familiar quilt with trembling fingers. The rage from last night had settled into something calmer, steadier, resolve waiting for a path. Beside the framed portrait of my husband, his kind eyes and silver hair forever captured in that photo, something caught my attention. A battered envelope I'd never noticed before. Its paper was so worn it looked almost translucent, fragile with age. My breath caught. The handwriting on the front was not mine, not my children's. Slowly, reverently, I opened it the way one would unfold a sacred relic. Inside was a small flash drive taped to the page. Beneath it, a note in his unmistakable script, steady, firm, and achingly familiar. If I go before you, I want you to have words. I want you to be heard. For the first time in ages, tears welled in my eyes, not as grief but as clarity. I lifted the USB as though it held the weight of the world. It felt lifeless in my hand until I remembered the power it might contain. With trembling hands I slid it into my old computer, the same one he and I had repaired together once, and watched as two files appeared. The first was labeled Voices Under Disregard. I clicked it and the room filled with the cruel echoes of my family. My son's voice. She's just a leftover, bitter, useless. Why bother bringing her along? Another voice, cold and smooth. Our new life doesn't have space for relics. And then my grandson, his tone cutting in its mockery. Grandma snores like a broken vacuum. Is she even alive? I swallowed hard. These voices weren't strangers. They belonged to the people I'd loved, raised, and protected. Raw, unfiltered, undeniable. Recorded evidence of my erasure. The second file was titled Final Guide. I pressed play and my husband's voice, worn with static but still warm, filled the emptiness. You raced them with everything you had. If I leave first, remember, Don't do it for pity but for dignity. You do not deserve to be erased. You deserve to be heard. His words landed like a hand pressed gently, firmly against my chest. I replayed the message again and again, memorizing every cadence, every pause. This was the threat I'd been waiting for. My jaw clenched with resolve. I saved the files 3 ways. On my laptop, on another flash drive hidden away, and in an email draft addressed to the local newspaper editor. The subject line read, "To the editor. This is the truth I carried in silence." In the body I typed, "Dear editor, I am writing anonymously because I fear the consequences of my truth. But I can no longer remain invisible." Attached are recordings, voices that reduced me to nothing, and a message from my late husband urging me to speak when silence was no longer bearable. I do not seek revenge. I seek memory. I signed it simply, a witness. Then with a steady breath I attached the files and pressed send. My eyes closed, my forehead resting against the cool surface of the desk. Outside, the world continued on, unaware of the quiet storm I had just released into it. Children played and laughed outside, traffic rolled on, surgeons worked in their operating rooms. Life went forward in its usual rhythm, blind to mine. 2 hours later, my laptop chimed with a notification. A story had gone live. My fingers shook as I clicked the link. The headline blazed across the screen. Texas widow exposes secret recordings. Family accused of ageism and betrayal. Right there at the top was my husband's message. "You don't deserve to be erased." His voice anchored the article, while my son's cruel words appeared in black and white like evidence in a courtroom. The journalist's tone was reverent, almost protective, turning my private heartbreak into something the public couldn't ignore. Minutes later the comments poured in. How could they treat her this way after all she gave? That man's success is built on cruelty. She was silenced. Now she will be heard. On social media, hashtags lit up like wildfire. Hashtag listen to elders, hashtag respect not relics. My cell phone, silent for months, suddenly lit up with a flood of calls, texts and emails. Former colleagues reached out in sorrow. Past students wrote to tell me they still carried the lessons I once taught them. A few messages brought me to tears. "I owe everything I've achieved to your belief in me." Away from the screen, the air itself felt different. Just yesterday I had been invisible. Today even strangers saw me. That evening my son posted a public apology. "I hurt the one person who loved me most. I was cruel. I am ashamed. I am sorry." Comments followed. Some forgiving, some condemning, but all acknowledging me. For the first time in so long I felt undeniable. Watching his video, tears rolled down my face. Not from weakness but from relief. The world had shifted and I hadn't needed to scream or beg. All I had done was reveal the truth and it had carried its own weight. Later I sank into my armchair, turning the flash drive over in my palm. The moonlight streamed through the window and kissed its edges. I placed it in a box with my husband's letters. It would stay there, not as a weapon for another fight, but as a quiet testament that I had not been erased. That night I wasn't just surviving, I was recognized. Tomorrow I knew I would walk taller. Not in celebration but in presence. The recordings didn't need me to shout. They only needed me to remain. And I would. I spent the night revisiting each voice, each syllable, pressing my husband's words against my heart like a vow. By dawn, clarity replaced hesitation. I knew what I had to do. Over the years I had quietly saved. A modest nest egg, just enough for security and independence. My husband and I had planned our later years carefully. A simple retirement, an emergency cushion, nothing extravagant. No one paid much attention. I was just the aging mother fading in their eyes. But that small sum would become the key to something far greater. I began researching in silence. My son's company, the empire he boasted was his creation, was actually a subsidiary under a holding company. That holding company had shares, public and available to anyone with the means. I found a discreet financial advisor, someone who understood discretion as well as numbers. Within days my money was quietly reshaped into power. I became the majority shareholder, legally, quietly, ruthlessly. When the day of the company meeting arrived, I walked into the sleek conference room. The air smelled of leather chairs and stale ambition. Executives whispered as I approached the head of the table. My son's face turned ashen when he realized who was taking the chair. His mouth opened, shut, opened again, but no words came. I sat down, my posture calm, deliberate. Silence wrapped the room. One by one I met their eyes. Managers, investors, those who had looked past me for years. Finally I spoke. You may call me what you like. A relic. A leftover. Bitter. I know who I am. But let me tell you, value isn't declared. It's recognized. And today many of you will recognize me. The room fell into stunned stillness. Then I continued. I announced the creation of a new department, respect and inclusion for senior colleagues. It would be enshrined in company policy. Any form of ridicule or dismissal based on age would be a reportable offense. Repeated violations would bring mandatory training, and in severe cases, disciplinary review. Heads lifted in surprise. Some faces hardened. My sons drained of all color. I ended simply, no one has the right to decide my age makes me worthless. From this moment forward, this company acknowledges that wisdom built over decades is worth more than the illusion of perfection. Then I stood, turned and walked out. The echoes of my heels on the polished floor sounded like reclamation itself. Later that day a notification arrived. My son had been reassigned, demoted from an executive role to a structural analyst, a position without influence or prestige. It wasn't revenge. It was balance restored. That evening I sat at my kitchen table replaying the strange journey from grief to agency. I realized it wasn't about punishing him. It was about showing the quiet strength that sparks change. My phone lit with messages, some filled with love, others with shame. My daughter-in-law stayed silent. I prepared myself a simple dinner, no celebration, no victory feast, just the calm presence of someone who had stood up, been seen and refused to vanish. The sting of last night's words, the betrayal whispered through walls, didn't disappear but they no longer had the power to define me. I leaned back, closed my eyes and for the first time in a long while my hands didn't tremble. My chest felt light. Recognition had found me not for who I once was, but for who I had become. I sat quietly in my office with the windows cracked open, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the floor. They stretched toward me like stubborn threads trying to pull me back into a past I had already outgrown. Just then my phone buzzed sharply. A notification flashed. A live stream already trending. I tapped the screen. My son's face filled it. Hair messy, eyes bloodshot, voice raw. My mom wrecked my career, he shouted at the camera. She used my money to buy the company and now I'm humiliated, demoted, ruined. His accusations cut not because they carried truth, far from it, but because of their sheer cruelty. They were projections, an attempt to shift the weight of his choices onto me. It was a pattern, really. He had offered me betrayal as a child and again as a man. But the world was watching now and they didn't fall for misplaced blame. The comments rolled in fast. Actually, she showed you had none. Ageism doesn't build legacy, it buries dignity. My grandmother would have been proud of her. Respect isn't given, you have to protect it. Within hours, headlines appeared. Ageist son demoted after harassing elderly mother. The tone wasn't sensational, it was factual, almost clinical. Harassment meet consequence. The backlash spread further. My daughter-in-law, who had cheered him on in my erasure, began losing clients. Her accounts bled out slowly, contracts dissolving. Some even publicly announced their departure. Within weeks she resigned. No drama, no spectacle, just the quiet reckoning of cruelty finding its cost. And then there was my grandson. My sweet boy. He sent me messages from school full of honesty only a child can give. The kids call me Grandma's project, but not in a good way, he wrote. He told me about 2 boys taunting him at lunch. Your grandma ruined you, didn't she? That pierced me deeper than my son's betrayal ever had. Not rage this time but sorrow. Collateral pain is the cruelest wound. The next morning I walked to his school and sat across from his teacher. He hasn't done anything wrong, I told her. But hurt echoes. He needs to know none of this is his fault. She nodded softly, promising to keep watch. At home I simmered a pot of soup, letting the steam curl upward, filling the kitchen with warmth. My grandson sat nearby, tapping quietly on his tablet. I set the bowls on the table, paused for a moment and then spoke gently. You know, I told him, success isn't something people hand you. It's something you protect with honor. He lifted his eyes to me. No one can take that from you unless you let them. In that moment I understood something simple and sharp. Achievements are blessings, not entitlements. When they're built on disrespect or prejudice, they don't just collapse outward, they rot inward. My son hadn't only lost his position. He had lost credibility. And that pain belonged to him alone. That night the house was quiet but not empty. I carried the warmth of the soup into my notebook. I wrote slowly, "Success is not a gift you can reclaim once it slips through your own hands. And age is not a flaw. It is the imprint of every lesson survived." I closed the book, steady, ready for whatever the next chapter might demand. The night outside was still, and I allowed myself not just relief but vindication, gentle, unshowy but real. Dignity once earned cannot be erased by ignorance. That was enough to sleep on. When morning came, I woke not to silence but to resonance. The world beyond my window had shifted, not because I begged for a stage but because I stood steady. And slowly people began to see. That day I took the first formal step. A foundation. Nothing extravagant. I named it the Legacy and Dignity Fund. Its mission was clear: to preserve and honor the contributions of working people beyond 60, to fund adult education scholarships, and to provide legal aid for those scarred by ageism. The seed money came from the company's revenue and my personal stake, not as a performance but as an anchor. We launched quietly. No gala, no champagne. Just a modest ceremony in the boardroom. A handful of employees sat in the front row, a few community leaders joined, and yes, reporters trickled in. But the soul of it wasn't in the press. It was in the people. The training sessions drew together people I never thought I'd see in the same room: an elderly mechanic eager to learn new skills, a single mother in her 40s tackling bookkeeping courses, and an immigrant seamstress receiving long overdue legal support. Then the newspapers lit up. "Widowed Texas grandmother transforms ageism into corporate legacy." The words made me wince at the spotlight, but deep down a quiet warmth rose in me. Recognition had found me, not through noise or spectacle but through persistence. On social media people reacted in waves. Empathy, support, outrage at the way my own family once treated me. Yet I didn't gloat. I wasn't interested in victory laps. I simply wanted dignity, long ignored, to have its voice. Meanwhile, my son, whose shaky public apology was slipping into the background, got asked to lead a community initiative called Respect Your Elders. He showed up in schools, church halls, and scout meetings, speaking with a voice that faltered at every mention of my name. "My mother, the woman I disrespected. I am sorry," he said, sometimes breaking down in front of strangers. I never demanded this from him. But to watch him step onto those stages, carrying humility instead of pride, it was more than I had ever dared to hope. My daughter-in-law, buried under the weight of public criticism, cut off contact altogether. Perhaps protecting her reputation had cost her what was left of her conscience. My grandson, once mocked by classmates, walked through school halls with new confidence. The children who used to jeer at him now kept their distance. He wore my quiet pride like armor. That afternoon I visited him. He handed me his report card. Not straight A's, just a scatter of B's and C's, but with a handwritten note from his teacher. "He's settled. The fear is gone." I squeezed his cheek and whispered, "You've taught them all more than I ever did." Later that evening I sat on the porch watching the sky bleed into soft pink. My notebook lay open on my lap, words forming as though the pen already knew where to go. Justice is not revenge. Justice is the restoration of humanity. I closed the book and exhaled. I had no urge to shout my truth anymore. My dignity, once cast aside, now stood tall, lifted even by others who saw its worth. As twilight deepened, neighbors drifted over. One woman, frail and bent with age, clasped my hand and whispered, "You gave us promise again." I squeezed her hand and replied, "Promise only works when it flows both ways." Inside me there was no drumbeat of triumph, no grand celebration. Just the steady comfort of knowing truth mattered more than being right. In a world that tried to erase me, I had shown them the quiet force of remembrance. Once I believed power had to roar, to demand its presence through clamor and spectacle. But living through the aftermath of the storm, I learned otherwise. True power doesn't shout. It settles like morning light across a worn floor. This morning I woke before dawn. The sky hadn't yet turned blue, the edges still soft with night. At my desk I opened my journal to the last line I had scribbled the evening before. Power is quiet. Legacy isn't passed down by blood. It's honored in how you endure when others try to erase you. That sentence felt like a seal not just for me but for anyone who had ever been silenced. I closed the book and set it gently beside a brass lamp whose glow I hardly needed these days. Words had finished with me for now, but the world still needed witnesses. So I rose, moving softly across the old oak floor until I reached the back window. Outside, the Texas sky was shifting, rosy with possibility, golden with patience. No music, no fanfare. Just dawn, steady and unhurried, arriving because it always does. I sat down with a shawl across my shoulders, eyes closed, breathing in the cool air. A memory stirred, my husband's hand in mine, pointing east at sunrise. Every day is an invitation, he used to say. I finally understood what he meant. In that moment I felt no weakness, no heaviness of age. I felt present, steady, alive, resolved. I had survived every attempt to erase me. My son had been humbled, my daughter-in-law disappeared into silence, my grandson regained his innocence. But this moment, this dawn, was not about them. It was never about revenge. It was about me, about the dignity I had managed to reclaim. Quiet conviction has a way of softening even the hardest ground beneath the feet of injustice, and I could feel that truth in every breath I drew. When the sun finally rose and painted the world with promise, I returned to my journal and wrote one last line. I want to be remembered not for what I fought against, but for the ones I refused to let go of even when I had the chance. I closed the journal with a deep sense of wholeness. The room around me, once a hiding place when I felt invisible, had transformed into a home, sustained by memory, built on endurance. Victory, I understood, doesn't always come with fireworks or banners. Sometimes it's nothing more than the calm you feel when you reclaim the ground that was stolen from you, not with noise, but with the certainty of simply existing. I stretched, stood up, and moved into the new day. No announcements, no fanfare, just dignity carried quietly forward. Because real strength isn't loud. It lives in the way you remain, and sometimes the softest presence lingers longer than the boldest shout. I've learned that some endings don't feel like closure at all. They feel like continuation. They're not marked by ceremonies but by permanence. And so, as the dawn lifted beyond the horizon, I returned to the window. Not to confront the world, but to greet it. The sun washed everything with gold. The weathered fence posts, the sagging porch beams, even the old oak tree leaning against the Texas sky. From that window, the same houses I once thought of as empty of meaning now seemed full of stories, full of memory. I clutched my journal close. Its cover bore the prints of my hands, nights of whispered belief, nights when all I could write was "I exist." I opened it to the last blank page thinking I might write more, but I stopped. Because I knew, the story wasn't mine alone anymore. It lived on in the lives I'd touched. In the mechanic eager to learn new skills. In the refugee mother finally enrolled in college. In the child at school who no longer feared disappearing. Their stories carried my own forward. I stepped onto the porch, the wooden boards creaking beneath me like they were glad to serve again. The swing held a cushion I'd placed there for quiet mornings such as this. Nothing dramatic, just a place to remember. A neighbor drove by, tipped his hat. A small gesture, but it carried gratitude. Not loud but lasting. Then my grandson padded out in his slippers, clutching his sketchbook. He sat beside me and opened to a drawing. 2 stick figures, one old, one young, holding hands above the words, "She stays." Something strong and slow bloomed in my chest. I didn't praise him, he already understood. Later I wandered into the garden. Roses half open, thirsty for light. I touched a dusty petal thinking about how every bloom takes its time. Not flashy, just steady growth. I pressed my palm into the soil, warm, alive, rooted. Inside, I lifted a framed photo of my husband from the mantel, setting it near the kitchen window where sunlight caught his face. I smiled. I had once been erased, yes, but never by him. At noon there was a knock at the door. The local reporter from the headlines stood outside, hat in hand, respectful. I invited him in and poured tea. We spoke not about scandal but about what happens after the noise fades. Some stories end in silence, I told him. And if you listen, that silence carries footprints. He nodded, and in his eyes I saw that he understood. By afternoon I sat at my desk sealing envelopes for scholarship checks. Small amounts perhaps, but powerful in their reach. Each stamp felt like an echo of dignity. Later, in the soft glow of evening, I gave a piano lesson to a woman in her 60s. She joked she came only to prove she could still learn. By the end of our hour, her hands formed chords so pure they rang like applause. Not for me but for the music that had always been waiting inside her. That night I jotted one more note at the bottom of my journal. No epilogue is needed when the echoes continue. I closed the book and stepped outside as dusk painted the sky in purple and silver. The air was cool, the silence almost holy. And in that quiet I understood. Legacy isn't carved in headlines. It lives on in the people who remember what you taught them even when you never said it aloud. I'm not written out of the story. I am still walking its pages. My silence was never weakness. It was strength shaped into grace. And in the end, it spoke louder than any insult could ever manage. So if my story touched you, remember this. For every voice like mine that's heard, there are countless others still hidden, waiting. That's why I share these truths, so they won't be forgotten. Subscribe to Grandma's Honest Stories to witness more untold lives. Moments of quiet strength, justice delivered without noise, dignity that refuses to fade. Because some truths don't just deserve to be remembered. They demand it.